Please be mindful. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome, friends, to our 5th True Tales of Terror. This one is called The Cassette. It follows 2 friends and their fateful journey into the unknown. Steve called his friend Mike, letting him know he was on his way. They had planned this trip for weeks, and both were pretty excited it was finally happening. 2 weeks prior, they had run into an old friend at a festival, and he had told them about this really strange store he had found by accident while roaming the streets and alleys of Brooklyn and Queens. Hidden from view and tucked into an alley, no visible signs. Their friend hyped it up endlessly as he drew them a map on a napkin he picked up off the ground. You can get anything. Handing over the napkin and reaching into his pocket, he produced 2 cards. Plain white on one side and jet black on the other. Handing one each to both friends. Anything? Mike asked. Anything, the old friend replied. Steve smiled as he put the blank card into his wallet. You'll need those to get in. Don't lose it, their old friend added. Mike looked at his card, examining both sides. Okay, he said, putting it into his pocket. They all shook hands, telling one another it was good to see them. Several weeks later, and here it was. The day they had waited for was finally here. The 2 friends headed south, getting on the freeway and putting the car into cruise. Steve took his foot off the pedal and settled in. Mike switched through the radio stations, foot tapping with excitement. I can't wait, he said, looking out the windshield. This is awesome, he added. Steve leaned back into the seat, rolling down the window slightly and lighting a cigarette. What do you think they'll have? He asked, thinking about what his friend had told him. Mike shouted, anything, adding, you heard him, he said anything, which clearly means everything. Steve flicked his cigarette out the window. Blowing the last smoke out the window, he hit the button to roll it up. Down the road they went, keeping the car at a steady pace in cruise control. They were getting close, and massive buildings came into view. We're almost there, Mike said, smiling. Steve knew it was still an hour to Queens, and traffic could make that double. They got on the Bronx Whitestone Bridge and crossed the wide East River, staying on the 678 and headed south on the Whitestone Expressway. After about 20 minutes, they crossed the inlet of Flushing Bay and merged onto the Van Wyck Expressway, winding southwest deep in the concrete of New York City. They took the exit off the 678 to Jackie Robinson Parkway. Enjoying the green of Forest Park, they followed it to its end and pulled onto Pennsylvania Avenue. Brooklyn on the right and Queens on the left. They found a good spot to park the car and got out, locking it. Mike took out his card their old friend had handed them at the festival weeks ago. He flipped it around, looking at it, its 2 blank sides, one white and one black. Steve took out the map drawn on a napkin and started off heading into Brooklyn on foot. Both friends kept a solid pace, moving quickly and snaking through alleys and one-way streets. Soon, their destination was close, and they both smiled like little kids on Christmas morning. "This is it, buddy," Steve declared, pointing at a dark alley lined with tall buildings. They turned off the street jammed with vehicles and random people milling about. Stepping into the alley and leaving the bustle of the city temporarily, both friends ventured down the alleyway. Dumpsters and cardboard boxes lined most of the alleyway, the occasional locked door in between. They passed a homeless man laying on the ground up against a dumpster. "You got a light?" the homeless guy muttered at the two friends. Steve went over and, bending down slightly, he lit the man's wrinkled cigarette. "Thanks," he said with a raspy voice. Steve took out one of his own and lit it, taking a deep drag. He let out a large puff of smoke. They were almost halfway down the alley now, leaving the homeless man behind them. Steve looked at the napkin again. "It should be right around here," he said aloud. Mike glared at the napkin. "Was he full of shit?" he asked, getting annoyed at the thought of trekking hours to the city for nothing. They both moved forward and came to another dumpster. Moving past it, there were concrete steps leading down under the building on their left. "Well, here we go," Steve said excitedly, and both friends descended the concrete steps and disappeared from sight. At the bottom, a door, unmarked. Mike reached for the handle and turned it. The door opened, and both friends hurried inside. Another hallway, short, and another door in front of them. A camera above it, infrared lights pointing at the two friends. A loud electronic lock clicked loudly after a short buzzing sound. Mike turned to the door they had entered through, trying its handle. "Dude, it just locked us in." Just as he finished saying the words, the second door opened, and a large man stood there, taking up the entire span of the door. He held out his hand at the two friends, and Mike reached over to shake the large man's hand, pulling his hand back and returning it back palm up. "Cards, gentlemen," the man said gruffly. Both friends produced their strange black and white cards, handing them over to the large man. He took both, one at a time, and removed an ultraviolet light from his pocket and shined it on the blank cards. A large pentagram reflected the purple light off the black side of the card. "First time, huh?" the large man said, looking down at the two friends. "Yeah," Mike said, as the large man handed them back the cards and stepped aside, allowing them to enter. They headed inside and looked around the massive interior. It was huge and dark. Fold-up tables evenly spaced along its expanse. Steve slowly walked through, looking at the tables, and couldn't believe the items available. Mike approached the table with a triple beam scale and stacks of small Ziploc baggies filled with powder. Steve was already a few tables down the row, amazed at the possibilities. Stopping at a table with stacks of VHS tapes along its top, he picked one up and looked at the handwritten title. Dog Fucker, it said. Steve returned it to its stack, seeing there was a whole series of Dog Fucker tapes. The man behind the table looked at Steve and said, "Not your thing? How about these? It's some real sick shit, man," pointing at the fourth row of tapes. Steve glanced down at the stack, its top tape labeled Gunshot Girls, and declined, moving up to the next table. Mike was still at the first table, handing the man cloaked in shadows behind the triple beam a wad of cash. "Wait up, bro," Mike yelled, catching up to Steve and passing the VHS table. The next table had weapons you couldn't find anywhere else, and Steve looked over the spread, eyes fixing on a couple of nice chrome handguns. The man behind the table looked up at Mike. "Bill Upstate," he started. "It's a ghost, my man." Steve, noticing it had no serial numbers. Mike played with a butterfly knife and put it back, seeing the man wasn't pleased with his actions. They continued forward, looking at the tables and the strange people operating them. Both approaching a table with a small, older woman behind it. Strange items lined her table, covered with a tapestry that had strange symbols on it. Several books, and some were very old. Statues of Bahamut, and reliefs of the goat. Candles and runes. Small bins of various herbs and sun-dries. On the far corner of this table was a cassette tape sitting there in its clear case, unlabeled. The old woman saw Mike looking at it and looked up to Mike with a grin. She spoke. "Ah, young man, does it call to you?" Mike picked up the cassette, flipping it around in his hand. "It's yours now," she said, and handed him a small piece of paper. Mike took both and slid them into his hoodie's front pocket. "Make sure you follow the instructions carefully, young man," the woman said, sitting behind the table of relics and all manner of the occult. Mike nodded, not paying her much mind, and they continued on, looking at the tables. The large room had several rows of tables, and the two friends walked along, stopping at a few and looking over their contents. Occasional chatter with the merchants. Steve continued through, stopping at a table with small vials of clear liquid, looking down at the blotter paper perforated into small squares. There were several, and some had pictures of cartoon characters. Others had designs and tie-dye colors adorning them. Steve watched as a man operated a tabletop pill press. Punching down a lever and pulling it back up, out popped a pill. "What you need, my man?" he asked, as he reset and made another pill on the press. "I'm good," Steve replied. And the man's cheerful expression faded away. The two friends spent over an hour checking out as much as they could, and suddenly, the large man that had let them in approached, and looking at the two friends, he said, "All right, fellas, time's up. Time to go." And they followed him back to the door. Nothing more was said, and the two friends left the strange black market buried under the streets of New York City. They walked back to their parked car and drove out of the city the way they had come in. Hours into the drive home, Steve looked at Mike and smiled. "Well, what did you think?" Mike pulled out a bunch of small Ziploc baggies, grinning. "I think our old friend was right," he said to Steve, pushing them back into his pocket. "That old lady was weird," Steve said, remembering her odd stare. "Oh yeah," Mike replied, and reached into his hoodie's front pocket, producing the cassette tape. The small piece of paper falling to the floor. "What's that?" Steve asked his friend as Mike retrieved the small note. He held it up and read it aloud. "A darkened room. 2 and no more. A single candle placed upon the floor. Play the tape to open the door." Mike laughed and folded the note, putting it with the cassette tape and back into his hoodie's front pocket. "Crazy old lady," he said, laughing. The two friends listened to the radio and drove back home. Soon they exited the highway and drove down the dirt road to Steve's house. It was starting to get dark and the sun was setting. Steve pulled into his driveway and both friends got out and headed inside. Mike sat on the couch looking at the cassette, and Steve left the room. Flipping through the channels on the TV, Steve returned after a few minutes and held an old cassette player in one hand and a candle in the other. "You can't be serious," Mike said, laughing, and Steve looked back at his friend. "Let's at least find out what's on that tape." Mike cut him off. "You don't believe that shit, do you?" he said to Steve. "I don't know, man. Everything else was real. Why would this be fake?" "Because hocus pocus bullshit isn't real, asshole," Mike said back. Steve took the remote and shut off the TV. "Let's see then," Steve said, placing the remote down on the coffee table, adding, "Come on, let's give it a go," and leading Mike to the back of the house. They both walked into the extra bedroom in the back of the house. Opening the door, Mike looked around at the empty room. It was empty of furniture and only had one large mirror attached to the wall, 2 windows, and a closet. Steve pulled out his lighter and lit a cigarette and the candle. Placing it on the floor, he pulled the blinds on both windows and returned to the candle, centered on the floor. Both sat down cross-legged, the candle in the middle of the two friends. Mike took the cassette out of his pocket and handed it to Steve. Steve opened its clear case and put the tape into the old boombox that sat beside him on the floor. Mike flipped off the room's light and returned to the candle, sitting down across from Steve. Steve reached over and turned on the old stereo and pushed play. And both friends listened as it slowly increased in volume. You could hear a light wind sound playing from the tape. And Mike thought he heard a fire crackling. And then the chanting started. A man with a deep voice spoke words they had never heard before. The chanting got louder. The words seemed to echo throughout the empty bedroom where the two friends sat on the floor with the candle in the middle. Suddenly, the candle blew out, and the chanting got even louder. The room completely dark without the candle's light. Steve was reaching to turn the cassette player off and was struck in the head by an unseen force. His body collapsed, unconscious. Mike heard the sound but saw nothing and was suddenly grabbed hard by his shoulder and flung into the air like a rag doll. Hitting the ceiling hard and smashing the overhead light into pieces. Mike kicked and flailed around and was let go, sending him soaring back down to the floor. As he was falling, he caught a glimpse of two large, glowing red eyes staring right at him, peering into his soul. He crashed hard to the floor, and his boot smashed into the cassette player, sending it flying and ejecting the cassette. The candle was lit again, and Mike got up holding his shoulder. Looking over, he saw Steve laying there unconscious. He made for the switch and tried to turn it on, but it had been smashed to pieces and broken glass was everywhere. Mike returned to Steve, crunching broken glass as he did. He sat him up and shook his friend, waking him up. Steve jumped to his feet and yelled at Mike, "Why the fuck did you hit me?" "I didn't," Mike said back, and Steve opened the closet, turning on its light. The room was trashed. Glass was strewn about from the overhead light. Mike took off his shirt, looking into the mirror. And there on his shoulder was a massive mark that looked like a hand shape, only way bigger than any human's. The cassette player was in the corner, overturned, and its tape deck open. Through some amazing luck, his falling from the ceiling had smashed into it and stopped whatever it was from happening. The tape was gone, and a large shape was burned into the hardwood floor. Steve picked up the candle and blew it out. The two friends never spoke of this again. Neither was quite sure what had happened, but they knew deep down it wasn't normal. They never found the cassette tape. This is one of those stories that really has no good explanation. Obviously, we're dealing with the unexplained and paranormal. Let's just hope nobody finds that cassette tape again. Well, friends, that does it for today's True Tales of Terror with Dretwog. We'll see you next time. Take care. Be safe out there. Thanks for watching.